So I'm actually really excited about this panel. We have some very distinguished guests with us here today. We've got Liz MacPherson. Liz is the Chief Executive and Government Statistician for Statistics New Zealand. Thank you for joining us, Liz. Dorothy Adams. Dorothy is the Acting Chief Executive for New Zealand's Social Investment Agency. Shai-lee Spigelman, and she's the CEO for Digital Israel. Also feeling very jet-lagged, having literally just stepped off the plane to join us here today. And then we have Tomáš, who is the Engineering Director for Google, who's over here from the United States. And Handley, founder for Aera Foundation. And again, he's just got off a plane. All of these people have literally just got off planes to join us here. So look, please do ask questions. It does really help as we go through the session. So we're just going to begin. We'll start with Liz, just doing the 5-minute introduction as to what she sees are the key issues around this theme of big data for predictive outcomes. Liz.
Kia ora tātou. As Rosalie said, I'm the CEO and government statistician, but I've also got a new role, and I'm going to be talking a bit from that perspective as well as the government's chief data steward. And in that role, I've got a responsibility to look across the data ecosystem, the public data ecosystem, and see where it is that we can realise more value, and think about the things that we need to do to realise more value. But it is, as a starting point, look, you all have seen data as the world's most valuable asset. From my perspective, in terms of a digital nation and in terms of good decision making, data is the lifeblood of a digital nation. And where the magic happens is where we get the integration between different forms of data. That's where we find the creative energy to solve some of those really hard problems. So data is often talked about as being oil, but I would actually like to say, well, data is a renewable resource, but it's only a sustainable resource where we maintain trust and confidence, and the trust and confidence of those who give us their data. And where trust is high and value is understood and distributed widely, then I think we have a digital nation that can flourish. And the key to this, the key to enabling the sort of work that I've been leading at Stats New Zealand, where we have a world-leading integrated data infrastructure that helps us solve difficult questions, is trust. And that's something we're going to have to keep building. And from that perspective, there's a number of things that have been mentioned during the day today in terms of that trust. The first one is something that I think that we're going to have to put more and more emphasis on, which is transparency. Now, I don't know about you, but I actually loved the Estonian example of transparency in terms of logins. I've already talked to Colin McDonald and said I'd back that one. I think that it would create incredible virtuous circles in terms of if individuals can see what we're doing with their data and they have the ability to look into it, then they're more likely to keep that data up to date. It's more likely to be more accurate. Then it feeds through to the other things that we can reuse it for. So really positive virtuous circles there. Really being transparent about what is used and how it's used. But I guess even more importantly is the transparency that comes from working together with the people who give you the data and the communities who are going to be affected to truly understand the value that can be created and working together to co-create in that space. So a focus on the outcome and working back from the outcome to the data. So what is it that we're trying to create together? What is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the value that we're trying to create? And then and only then talking about the data that we need. The other thing that of course is important from a trust perspective is autonomy. and putting more control in the hands of those whose data it is. And one of the things that I've often thought about is how we think about the data that we hold within Statistics New Zealand, for example. How do we turn the integrated data infrastructure, which is a research database, into my IDI, something that can tell me about my outcomes? So ultimately, I just wanted to leave you with this thought. As we think about the digital nation, every design decision is an opportunity for transformation. And let's make each one count.
Liz, thank you very much. Dorothy, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. So I follow on quite nicely from Liz, that I'm going to talk about the opportunities and pitfalls that come from using linked data like the IDI and advanced analytical methods to focus resources really where we need them. I'm going to draw on an example of predictive risk modelling that we did at the Ministry of Social Development when I was there. I also want to talk a little bit about the lessons, many hard lessons that we learned, which have, I think, broad application. So about 6 years ago when I was at the Ministry, we commissioned a study from Auckland University. We wanted to know, can administrative data be used to identify children at risk of adverse outcomes? Why? Too many children in this country don't live the kinds of lives that we want for them. Last year, just over 12,000 young people and children had a substantiated finding of abuse. In 2012, we had a white paper for children, which acknowledged that this wouldn't change unless we could better identify, assess and respond to those children. So this was at a time when we were just starting to understand the real potential value of linked data and analytics to help us answer the really hard questions. So the university developed a predictive risk model that automatically generated a risk score for all children arriving in the benefit system before the age of 2. The model predicted the likelihood of each of these children having a maltreatment finding by the age of 5. I'm going to read out the results so I don't get the numbers wrong, but the core model had a fair approaching good strength in predicting maltreatment by age 5. For those of you who work in the space, the area under the rock curve being 76%. So just to give you a sense of that, that's a similar strength to the predictive strength of mammograms for detecting breast cancer in the general population. The children identified as most at risk represented 37% of total maltreatment findings, while making up 5% of the total general population. While these results were promising, no model is 100% accurate. If you think about 100% as perfect strength and 50% is no better than tossing a coin, any model will inevitably make some errors, false negatives, false positives. However, I have to say one benefit of risk stratifying any population of interest that you can find a suite of appropriate programs of varying intensity across that spectrum of risk. In response to Auckland's work, we commissioned an ethical evaluation that found that while the application of predictive modelling to child maltreatment raises significant ethical concerns, many of those concerns could be substantially mitigated. Remaining concerns may plausibly be regarded as outweighed by the very considerable potential benefits of the model. Can I just say, all of this, we had a number of ethical evaluations done. They're all on the Ministry's website. I really recommend them to you. They're very, very good pieces of work that have stood the test of time. Finally, Auckland recommended that operationalising a model required careful, deliberate and phased implementation and strong engagement with providers and frontline staff. In 2016, the then Child, Youth and Family undertook a trial to assess whether care and protection intake decision-making could be improved by giving social workers access to a statistical risk tool. The findings suggested that yes, it could, in the form of what they called a background risk indicator that had the potential to improve care and protection intake decisions. Results from that trial highlighted that when this information is used successfully, social worker decision-making is influenced in a safe and controlled manner, an expected manner. So some of the lessons that we learned, and look, we've heard these throughout the day, so ethical considerations matter. The potential benefits of any data use need to be compared with ethical and legal concerns. And I would say that that comparison should be with the next best available alternative, not just some theoretical idea. And while some concerns, such as privacy, will run across many use cases, others will be very specific to the nature and the potential impact of the work that you're doing. In the case of the children's model, that ethical evaluation made 17 recommendations, for example, to the risks, which included included compounding surveillance bias, stigma, use of data without explicit informed consent. Building and maintaining public support. To Liz's point, we had a change of minister when we were doing this work. We made a serious error in briefing her on this complex and potentially controversial work through a written report. This resulted in a very public, these children are not lab rats comment. This not only slowed down the work, but more importantly, it undermined public trust and confidence. And it was at this point we realised we actually didn't have the social licence to do the work. In fact, I think in 2012, we hadn't even heard the term social licence. Transparency matters, and I won't go into that because Liz, I think, has covered that really well. Language matters, clearly illustrated by the adoption of the term background risk indicator with social workers. I do remember when we started the modelling work, we just couldn't engage child, youth and family. But when we stopped talking about risk scoring and started talking about the more effective allocation of scarce child protection and early intervention resources, we got their attention. And finally, and I could spend a whole session just on this, understanding the strengths and the limitations of the data really matters too, and the methods that you apply. Data availability and quality are important considerations for predictive modelling. Questions too about the extent of bias in administrative data and how this plays out in any models. So having said all of this, I do believe there's an important role for data and analytics in improving social outcomes. You can't expect to be able to focus resources where they're really needed if you're running blind without the information and the insights and the tools that you need. However, that doesn't come at any cost. We must approach what we do and how we do it with great care, including always asking the question. And we learnt this the hard way. Not only could we, but should we? Thank you.
Dorothy, thank you so much. I'd like to invite Shai-lee.
Can you hear me? Yes, now can. So first, thank you for having me here. It's a real treat. So for us in Israel as well, data and big data, of course, is a major issue for the government and government policies, the new gold, the new oil, the new everything. And we do have a very strong data scientists and data engineers in Israel coming from the military and stuff, and it's a huge focus of the government. I wanted to share one or two youth cases that what we did with or trying to do with big data, and also maybe talk about one or two challenges if I have time. So my first youth case or example is big data in digital health. So in Israel, we have a lot of data, digital clinical health records. They say one of the largest databases in the world. Not sure if anybody actually measured that, but because we have very strong HMOs, and we started collecting digital clinical health records from the 90s, by now we have very strong data. The question is, what are we going to do with that data? And for the government, it's a big challenge, because we don't want only to improve our health system, which is, of course, we all want to do. We also want to use that data to attract private sector players and make that industry, the digital health industry, one of the leading or growth engines in the country, leading industries. And it's like we did with cyber. So what are we doing as a government, and this is where the government role kicks in, is we trying to create the right infrastructure of that data to, for once, improve the health system, but also create that industry as a growth engine. We did a few things. First, we developed a very, very elaborate regulation concerning that data. So, and thinking about challenges, this is a big challenge, because you create a regulation or policies on future thing that you actually don't know what's going to be the uses of that data. So how do you, for one hand, create the right regulation that is be open enough for the industry, but protective enough for the privacy, when you actually don't know where you're going, and in 10 years, probably everything will look different. And you can't change that every year. It takes a long time. So we created a very elaborate regulation. We're now creating a big data a database based on the clinical health records, genetic data, and some other data together, which will be open anonymously, of course, to the industry and to researchers and to startups, being part of the startup nation, to be able to use that data both for improving our health system, but also for, again, attracting the private sector, global players from the private sector. So building this huge database out of volunteers, we are aiming 100K volunteers, building the right infrastructure, working with HMOs and other health organizations how to open their databases, but also having them build the right infrastructure inside the health organization to be able to work with scientists and to work with startups and to work with all these players to provide that data, have the clinical tests and exams and everything inside the organizations. So the government role here was to orchestrate all that so we will be able to actually leverage that data we have already and being collected from the 90s to a better use. So this is one use case. The other use case I want to mention is what we are doing in the education system. So in Israel, we have a lot of data in the education system, but it's not centralized. It's very hard to get or to make decisions or policies based on that data. Some of it in the municipalities and the cities, some of it in the Ministry of Health, Education, some of it is in the schools. It's all mixed. So what we're working now as a government is creating an architecture of that data from all the different sources. So from cities, from schools, from teachers, from the Ministry of Education itself, create the right architecture so we will be able to use that data for better decisions in the future. So, for example, we want to have small classes. Everybody wants to have small classes. What is the right number of small classes? Do we need to have 28 students, 32 students, 34 students? What's the right number? If you don't have the data to check and do an A/B testing, having this kind of classes and other kind of sizes of classes and see what works best, how would we be able to decide the right policies? So now we want to use that data that we are now collecting from all the different sources to perform better policy decisions in our education system. So we know in the future, in the near future actually, what the right way to intervene or what policies the government to set based on that data to have a better education system. So these are two quite different examples I wanted to share, and when we have time later, I want to share some challenges we have with that implications. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Tomáš, you'll be bringing a different perspective coming from the Google engineering role. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about AI?
Thank you. Kia ora. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So I lead a team of engineers and scientists at Google that do machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I know that advances in that technology are some of the catalysts to why we're having a debate about big data and the opportunities that those techniques can provide. So I thought I would bring the perspective to you of a practitioner of the field and share with you points around three areas. One is kind of setting the context. What is AI? How does it work? Number two is to share with you the fact that these tools are already transformative today, and you probably have them in your pockets, and they're making products better. And number three, there are some real challenges that it's worth thinking about as we're talking about applying these tools to predictive outcomes. So let me start with the first one, setting the context. What is AI? One useful way of thinking about it is it's the science of making things smart, right? And you can do that in lots of different ways. You could do it by hard programming rules into machines, for instance, to make them respond to complex situations in smarter ways. A really effective way of making things smarter happens to be machine learning. And that's a set of techniques that make it possible to build systems that don't rely on these hard-coded rules, but instead learn from observing lots and lots of examples. And that's really the key, the flexibility of not having to hard program them, but using data and observations to teach them to learn. And this is already having transformative impact in our lives. There are many examples in products. One that I like a lot, because it's very empowering, is Google Translate. The ability to do machine translation between languages can be quite an empowering experience when you're in a place where you don't speak the language. It lets you communicate, right? But there are also transformative use cases in health, in science, in energy. Just to mention one in health, we've done a study in India on diabetic retinopathy and train a machine learned model to try to predict that condition, which can lead to blindness. And that model actually performed on par with ophthalmologists, eye doctors. And that's an amazing result. It means that eye doctors could potentially partner with this system to aid in diagnosis and speed up diagnosis, et cetera, especially for folks who don't have access to regular checkups. It's also exciting to see what folks do with open platforms and tools that are available to anyone, because AI actually is something that folks can do now without even having machine learning background. There's a great example here locally. Researchers at Victoria University use TensorFlow to train a model to distinguish between different types of bird calls of threatened species of birds, and that helps in conservation. So there's lots of transformative potential in AI, but it is also useful to think about the challenges and the barriers that might exist in developing AI systems that can really benefit everyone. And Dorothy mentioned quality of data, and that's an important issue as well. And so to this, I'd like to give you, encourage you to think about what are actually the different notions of fairness. I think it's important to develop these systems in a fair and inclusive way. And one that we often think about as practitioners of AI is the data quality. Are we building systems are we building models that reflect the data accurately? And is the data reflective of reality, right? Is it collected and annotated in the right way, in a way that reflects reality? But on the other hand, another important notion to think about is reality fair? In cases where reality isn't fair, policies might be needed to address that, right? And the good news is that machine learning systems can actually be used as a tool to address this as well, and it is possible to build systems, ML systems, in a way that incorporate policy. That there's one result that I could tease, which is a paper that was a collaboration between Google and some universities on equality of opportunity in machine learning. And that's an interesting result of incorporating policy into the way a model is built so that it's fair and inclusive. So AI is science of making things smart. Machine learning makes that possible using data and learning from observations. It's transformative potential, but it's also useful to think about the barriers and challenges like bias and fairness.
Thank you, Tomáš. Now, Derrick has joined us and he has the flu or bronchitis, so he may be a little bit husky. Derrick, thank you.
No worries, I'm fine. So I think this has been really fascinating hearing the four different angles to this topic. When I was reflecting on it, I thought of a couple different stories to share to illustrate perhaps a different way to think about some of these issues, particularly for New Zealand. Just over 10 years ago, I was building a company. If you can imagine, the iPhone has just come out, and what we were doing was helping a lot of the largest corporates in the world migrate from the web to mobile. So one of our clients was Toyota, and as we helped their web and their other assets become mobile related, we also were directed to collect as much data and information as we could about a prospective or potential buyer. So we were collecting everything about their preferences, their psychographics, their very specific niche needs and desires of a particular vehicle, their income brackets, their locations, anything that we could physically collect, of which we could collect a lot more of using a phone. We would then hand these over, wrapped in these very tight privacy contracts to Toyota's marketing department, and purveyed over by the legal department. And after all of that, at the end of the day, when all the marketing engine was tied end to end, the only thing that ever happened was if you went and tried to buy a Toyota, you would get an email from the dealer that was closest to you. And that dealer would get an email saying that Derrick wants to buy a car and you're the closest dealer. Fast track 10 years, last year I wanted to buy a Toyota. I live in upstate New York. We were moving out of Manhattan, and we wanted to get a Forerunner. So I went on the website, and I gave every bit of information that I would have done 10 years ago, including the trim and the different accessories, the color, my location, my zip, my income, because I actually also applied for a finance lease. So that went through Toyota Finance. Everything and more, as you can imagine, with 10 years moved on. Do you want to guess what the outcome was? I got an email telling me what my local dealer was, and the local dealer got an email telling me that I was in the market for a Toyota. So we drove up, and we bought a Forerunner that was not the same color that I really wanted. It had running boards, which I didn't ask for, but I liked. It was cool, and we drove it away. My point is that, in my experience, particularly working with organizations, an enormous amount of data is collected and never ever used. And it's because there's no thought as to why and how the data should be used. So people are just collecting masses and masses and masses of amount of information, or not even information, just data, and then just defaulting to the very minimum because they become overwhelmed with what's possible or what they could do. I think another similar scenario that happened to me in New Zealand as I was looking into a couple of issues last year that were capturing my imagination. Again, for people who are not familiar with New Zealand, we have a lot of talk about a housing crisis in Auckland, and related to that, an affordability crisis in Auckland, and related to that, a teacher shortage in Auckland. So I was fascinated by a number of things, particularly about this idea that we have a teacher shortage, and that no one could quite figure out what this actual number was of how many teachers we needed, or that we had, or how many jobs were open. So when we talk about social policy and big data and all this kind of information that you might need to direct yourself towards one of the most important issues in society, whether it's housing, education, and health being probably the third most important, I went looking to understand how many teachers are there in Auckland, how many jobs are open, how many current teachers are open and up for applying for jobs, and by doing this basic maths, what's the variance? How many teachers are we short? Do you have any idea how many teachers we are short in Auckland? Well, your guess is as good as anyone else's in the room, because no one else has any idea either. So even though every single principal of every school might have a clue as to how many jobs they've got open and how many people have applied to their jobs, no particular neighborhood, and let alone the city, let alone the country, has any idea of this very simple set of numbers, which I would call small data, which I'm sure he and I in a room and a weekend could knock out some basic piece of web software and ask the 2,000 principals in Auckland to update once a day and create the information and the insights that we need, but yet we don't have it. So I think as we think about big data and machine learning and the possibilities of it, particularly in New Zealand, when we look at these issues and we think we have to do reports to find out if people with Chinese-sounding names are buying the houses in Auckland, these are the key lifeblood sets of information that we need to be able to run and build our country, and they have nothing to do with big data, and we don't have them. So my suggestion would be some of us be thinking about what small data sets are that we're missing that we should be considering building.
Derrick, thank you. There's a lot of provocative questions and issues that come up here, because we're describing big data as the lifeblood of digital nation and the predictive futures, but at the same time, we're not asking the right questions. We don't know what to do with the data that we've got. It's not usable. The quality of it may not necessarily be there. And then we have all the challenges around license and how do we surface and even make it available to third parties to become even more useful. And that's before we get to AI. So what I'd like to throw open to the panel is the question that just basically is, what do you think we must do now, both as businesses, as government, as a country, to get a future-proof and fit-for-purpose, I guess, data set or data capability for New Zealand? I started with a nice, easy question. Yeah, small question.
I can say, I don't know what for New Zealand because I don't know. I can say what we are doing. We should do in Israeli government, and I guess should be replicated to New Zealand as well. I would say we should have a very strong and elaborate data strategy. So we need to know what we want to collect and how we want to collect it, what we are collecting today and we definitely don't need to collect. So just understand, having a strategy, what we want to collect, what we're collecting we don't need, and what we already have and how to use it. So that strategy will help us build the right infrastructure and policies and regulation attached to that. I was hearing your story about the teachers, and I thought we have exactly the same problem, and it's even more complicated, because even if we knew which kind of teachers we have today and what the shortage is, the question is what kind of teacher we will need to have in 5 or 10 years, because we need to train them now. So would we need the physics teachers? Would we need the math teachers? Would we need the English teachers? I need to know what kind of shortage there is today, but the more important question is what the shortage will be in 10 years, because we need to collect them and bring them into college today and make sure that in colleges for teachers we train the right professions that we will need in 10 years. So the predictions, that's what's important, the growth of the populations, the new subjects and everything. So the data will need to be very smart. So having the right strategy will help us to build step by step where we need to be in, 5 or 10 years, 2030.
Yeah.
Liz?
Agree entirely, which is why we're currently working on something called a data roadmap. So the idea behind that is exactly what you've just been outlining, Shai-lee, which is, what do we want to know? What do we need to know as a country? And what do we need to collect? But what do we actually want to be able to source? Because collection is old language to a certain extent. It's what do we need to source? What sort of infrastructure do we need to make best use of this? What sort of capability do we need? And so that's all part of a roadmap which we need to work on with the people in this room to really understand what it is we as New Zealand need, and then design it in. But do it in a way which is flexible. Because there's one thing that I've learnt since I've been in this role is that if you decide to build something that's going to be done in 5 years, it'll be out of date. If maybe 3 years, it'll be out of date. You need to be flexible, and you need to build something which can evolve over time.
One of the things we talk a lot about in the Social Investment Agency where I work is data democratisation. That's just a flash term for put the data we do have in the hands of others. And they'll soon tell you what the quality's like. If you start shining a light on those sorts of things, you'll soon start to get to quality, understanding that, what you put around your collection points is critical, what the gaps are, what you can do with what you've got. So put it in the hands of others and let them help you improve the data. And that's really pitched more at government, because I think government holds a lot of data, we hold it to ourselves, we have an unequal playing field, and so I think we do need to bring more people into the use of it.
That raises one really interesting question from the floor, which it comes back to that idea of government or business as a platform and being able to share while still maintaining control over privacy and personal data. How do we begin to do that? Who leads in actually starting to do that and unlock where you may not have the data sets, others may have those data sets that can be integrated to give you a fuller picture?
I think actually industry companies do have a role here. We at Google really believe in open sharing of ideas around both the benefits of AI and the challenges of AI. And there are multiple ways that we do that, but one is supporting academic research and also releasing some data sets to enable others to innovate using them. My domain is computer vision, video analysis, and we've released some very large data set in that domain as well. I have one point I wanted to make to the previous question, which is what should we be doing now? And this notion of future-proofing is really difficult to think about, right? How can you really be future-proof? But all the points that were made were great. One thing that I think is useful to think about is what are the principles that guide what data we want to collect and why we want to do it, right? Those first principles can really drive a lot of the other decisions. So for instance, at Google, our first principle is to do what's right for our users, focus on the users. And there, the example that you gave with Toyota, right? Expectations that people will have, I think, are important. If I'm signing up, indicating my interest in a car, then me saying what kind of color I prefer, etc., I would expect you to use it in a way that benefits me, right? But there might be other data where I would be surprised that you're using it in a particular way. So I think bringing value to the users of whatever the system is could be one of the first principles. And so establishing those, I think, is important.
That's an interesting question, because we've talked a little bit about license and trust, and yet all of us have so much of our data that is available because that's part of the hyper-connected world that we live in. So how do we... do you think that for many people they actually maybe understand better and are more open, and this is one of the questions, for a different risk position with some of their personal data if they understand the parameters and they can see the value?
Yeah.
They're more open.
Yeah. That actually today, yes.
I think people are pretty free and open with their data now, right? I wasn't joking. I think Google and Apple do know most. I think they do know more about New Zealanders and their behaviours and their livelihoods than the government of New Zealand probably does. And if you're in America, then you include Amazon as well. Then so I think corporations are now have got so much information that it's gotten almost. I think it's gotten a bit out of hand, right? I think where it's heading is quite a dangerous place. You've got a monopoly on information about people. And I think a lot of people are hoping blockchain-type solutions or breakouts will enable the similar kinds of services that these big tech companies do today, but in a way that's got privacy and got much more control without some kind of ad-driven model. Because obviously Facebook too. Facebook and Google are mostly driven by ad revenue, which means you need the data to drive effective advertising, which is one industry that really does use the data because that's what people buy. They buy the targeting. I think to your question, a couple of questions ago about New Zealand, the idea of having some sort of principles or having a strategy, I think, like anything, you have to figure out what it is you're trying to solve. So what are you trying to solve for in New Zealand at the moment? What are the biggest social or economic challenges that we are going to solve for? And when I was in economics in high school, I was fascinated that the country had decided to solve for inflation and had designed this tool and this methodology and this philosophy that they've stuck to for 20-something, 30-something years because they knew that this was a tool they were solving for. And so all the data that they needed to collect to make those decisions on a quarterly basis about inflation, if I was thinking about what's New Zealand's data strategy, I would start thinking about what are some key things that we're committed to solving. There's this futurist called Buckminster Fuller who referred to these kinds of things as trim tabs, where you think about what are the small levers or dials that you can adjust that make a big difference. And I think with data, you start there, like what is the stuff that's going to make the biggest difference, because 90% of it isn't.
Yeah, I think that was the point I was making about what are the questions we want to be able to answer. What do we want to be able to solve? What are the big things? On your point, though, about privacy, some of the research that was done by people like the Data Futures Partnership shows that while I agree, like my daughters, for example, share all sorts of information, that privacy is situational. So what I'm prepared to share on Facebook with my friends, I may not be prepared to share with someone else. And what I'm prepared to share with my doctor, I may not be prepared to share with my insurance agent. There's all these sorts of, I may not be prepared to share with government. So we need to actually find a way, blockchain may well be it, I don't know, but a way in which we can actually manage those differential privacy concerns and also that autonomy over the data.
That does raise that that question, and how do you manage that, where something is acceptable because it's helpful to you, and then suddenly it becomes creepy? It's like, hang on, you know way too much about where I am and what I'm doing right now. How do you manage that tension?
I think having avenues for people to provide feedback is important. I think I totally agree. Trust is very important in all of this, and part of that is transparency in terms of what do we do with the data and what do we even have, and having some amount of control, but also having recourse, right? These models that we might be building for predictive outcomes, they won't be perfect, right? And so having some recourse, some way of saying you got this wrong, providing feedback, I think is also important.
There's an interesting question here, which I think goes to perhaps some of the comments around blockchain, which is, should we be creating technology that enables people to own and manage their own information? Can you talk a little bit about what that might look like, or is that perhaps the way forward? I'm probably looking at you, Tomáš, to be honest.
Tools to manage your own data. I think it's an interesting idea, and we at Google have built tools that make it possible for you to see what data we're using in which of our products and have some control over it. And I think that is important for users to understand how we're using their data and how we're delivering benefit. I think it's a complicated question to understand because there are different granularities of what is data, and at a very fine level of granularity, this might be not a tractable thing. So I think maybe the levels of granularity would be important to think through.
I think for a government perspective, the citizens would want to know which information the government has on that citizen. And I know, for example, the Estonian government, one of the representatives here, they have a system that you actually can see what information each agency, government agency, has on you, and then you can, I think that actually builds trust with the government and make sure that you know what data they have, what they have on you, what they don't have. We actually would love to have something like that. I think for private sector, it's more complicated, and Google, of course, has so much information. I don't know, I need books to understand what they have, but for government, it's different. And I think to build trust between citizens and government, it is important that the citizens will know which kind of information the government holds on them and how they're going to use it. I think that will actually be a very good idea.
I think it's one thing I agree, to be transparent about what data, let's say government agencies might hold on me, but then it's to also understand how that data might be being used. Because I think it always comes back to purpose, and it's really hard to explain to people, what you might be using the data for. And we think about this a lot, and my experience has been is when you talk one-to-one in small groups about what you're actually using data for, in very concrete terms, we're doing this for this reason, people mostly see the value. What I don't know yet is how you then scale that so people really understand what sits behind the black box of a predictive model, for example. And I think we're still trying to think that through.
How much of this, and how much of the challenge that we face is around personal literacy around data? And the reason that I ask this is going back to one of the points that you made, Liz, which is that often at an executive level, data is just not part of the conversation. It's not treated as an asset, and if it is thought about, it's more in the way of measuring the impact of what's happened in the past, as opposed to how it can be a useful tool for guiding your decisions for the future. And I just wonder how much of that is a factor for us in New Zealand.
Well, based on some of the research again done by the Data Futures Partnership, it would suggest that we're not having those conversations at our top tables, not in government, not in many private sector agencies, particularly in small business and in NGOs, and that for that reason we're actually not really realising the value of the data that we hold and what the purposes we can put it to. I suspect some of that does go to a literacy with the data. from that perspective, it seems to me that it would be possible to build that capability, to have some people who can explain and talk that language at the top table. But at the moment, I think a lot of times those sorts of things are left to your CDO and your CTO, and they're not. You don't have it at the top table. That sort of conversation.
In the first 2 years of doing this job, I spent a lot of time with ministers, educating them in the use of data to make decisions. It was a very interesting experience. I remember working with one minister where we used a very simple model to make decisions around who should be targeted for employment assistance programs. And even though we could show her the data being used, how simple the model was, in the end she just couldn't make the decision based on what came out of those models. She had to go back to what she understood. So yes, and I think some of that, it just takes time. You have to keep going and you have to educate, and people have to get comfortable with making the decision. I've always thought as officials it's our job to give those decision makers at the top table the confidence to make decisions that are data informed.
What I'd like to do now is just throw forward a little bit, because it's very easy to focus on the challenges that we've got, and I suspect that New Zealand's not unique in most of those. If you were looking ahead to 2030 and you were thinking in your particular area, what would success look like in big data? What would it be empowering or enabling in your particular area?
What's your particular area? Like what you're doing?
Yeah, for you.
Well, I'm going to ignore that and say what we should be doing for New Zealand. I think, as I said, for a country, we should be focusing on what the purpose of our country or the livelihoods of our citizens should be. So if you ask people what they want in life, they pretty much want to be happy, right? And they want to live lives that have meaning, that they feel they're contributing, that they're actually flourishing. And we should be figuring out a whole new way of understanding the data that is required to construct such a life, right? We have lived on the back half of an era that has correlated economic growth and GDP directly with some sort of prosperity and well-being. And we need to move forward to an era where we're talking about totally different data sets that are around the well-being of people. There's lots of different ways in which people are doing that, social progress index and well-being indices, other things like that, that when you define what are the things that make people's lives meaningful and work backwards with the things that they're going to need in their lives to achieve that, figure out what the data is that supports that, and then make the policy changes that support those outcomes. That kind of world is totally possible, especially in a country like New Zealand. And if you get amazing, great data sets, you apply machine learning and other kinds of things, you can predict and forecast the kinds of behaviors we should want to do, kind of actions we should want to take, which will create those kinds of futures. I don't think, at the moment, we're anywhere near there, but 2030 is definitely a way to get there.
I'm afraid that we're going to have to stop there. I ended on a very big question, so I do hope that you keep the conversation going and you take advantage of the opportunity to talk to the panellists as we go forward. I'll just hand over to Rod.
Thank you very much indeed for another terrific panel. And I'm sorry that I was being a hard watcher of the clock here because I'm very mindful we've got an interesting logistics exercise in due course, which is to get many of you off in buses to the Technology Innovation Showcase. So a very big hand, please, for our panelists just now. Thank you.